Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon got married. And then they got busy leading the Reconquista, which by 1492 had reconquered all areas formerly under Muslim control, uniting Spain as a Catholic state. Sacramento high fives all around, y'all. And so the glory of that victory got them real itchy to spread Catholic Christianity all around, formerly under Muslim. Got busy leading the Reconquista, which by 1492 had reconquered all areas formerly under Muslim control, uniting Spain as a Catholic state. Sacramento high fives all around, y'all. And so the glory of that victory got them real itchy to spread Catholic Christianity as far as they could. And I hope you're starting to connect the dots by now, because what else happened in Spain in 1492? Christopher Columbus showed up before the Spanish court looking for money to sail west. And so as the Spanish got their American empire running, they sent measuring buttloads of Catholic missionaries right along with the conquista. Doors in order to convert the native populations to Christianity. Now, keep that in your back pocket, because we're going to come back to it in a minute. But for now, let's consider the final cause of European exploration, which is, say it with me, glory. Or if you're not that sassy, you could say that these are the political motives. So once contact was made between the old and new worlds, it quickly became a competition.
Yeah, what's up? I'm just sending around my club thing.
My submission failed, but then now I can't submit anything anymore.
Did you try to submit on your phone?
This is my phone.
What do you mean practice test?
It's a practice test.
It's a PDF, so you took a picture of it on like
yeah,
your
I need to
Genius
take a
thing?
picture if I can. And it says it's not submitted, so I don't know what to do.
Okay, just refresh. Math? What's up? No, it's not a big problem.
It is a
Oscar.
big deal, actually.
Submit it. Your submission. See, just refresh. It's fine. It's fine. Now drink water like your mom told you to.
This is the wrong one.
Huh?
That's the wrong one.
What's your practice test?
You did the practice test review. Do I click retry?
Okay. Yeah, retry. Oh, okay. Go well.
Between European states to acquire colonial possessions in order to shift the balance of power in their favor. Additionally, political change was occurring in some European states in which large multi-ethnic empires were breaking apart while some kingdoms were becoming united and more powerful. And that new political reality in which a state ruled over a people with similar language and culture and history was known as the nation state. Anyway, these political changes meant that European powers were eager to be the greatest on the world stage. age, and the way to become great was to build maritime empire. And as you might expect, that eventually caused some tension, and a good example here would be the spat between Portugal and Spain over their respective New World claims. Long story short, Portugal was getting a little saucy over the fact that Spain was gobbling up colonial territory in the Americas that belonged to Portugal. So they did what any Christian state would do and geared up a fleet of ships to go blow Spain's crap up. But since they were both Catholic states, the Pope got involved and settled their dispute by drawing a line of demarcation which settled the question of which New World territories belonged to whom. In 1494, the line was moved slightly and codified in the Treaty of Tordesillas, which established Portugal's claim over a part of Brazil and Spain's claim to dang near every other part of the Americas, much of which they didn't even know was there yet. Now, conspicuously absent from these negotiations were the indigenous Americans themselves, and I think it's safe to say that they were not nearly as stoked about the treaty as were the Spanish and the Portuguese. And I'll get back to that, but for now I need to tell you about perhaps one of the most significant effects of European exploration during this period. That's right, it's everybody's favorite interoceanic transfer, the Columbian Exchange. And let's start with a definition. The Columbian Exchange refers to the transfer of plants, animals, minerals, diseases, and people between the Old and New World. And in case you don't know, the Old World is how Europeans refer to their world, namely Afro-Eurasia. New World is how Europeans refer to the Americas, despite the fact that the Americas were every bit as old as the Old World, but, you know, whatever. Anyway, maybe the transfer of stuff between Old and New Worlds doesn't sound like much of a big deal to you. Those guys got a potato, those guys got a turkey. Who cares? Well, my dear pupil, allow me to explain, because the Columbian Exchange was arguably the most significant demographic and environmental and ecological change that you'll have the pleasure of studying in all of world history. So let's start with the transfer of disease. Now, because folks throughout Afro-Eurasia, or if you're sassy, the Old World, because they had been in contact for millennia, they had developed immunities to each other's nasty cooties. However, because of the isolation of indigenous peoples of the Americas, the diseases Europeans introduced were devastating. Smallpox was the most devastating disease, and it was first introduced to the Caribbean by Spanish explorers. Eventually, it spread throughout Mexico and Central America and killed around half the indigenous population there, and then spread into South America with similar devastating results. In fact, evidence suggests that by 1600, some indigenous populations were reduced by 90%. So now, tying it all together, you can see why Spanish conquistadors were able to conquer such massive empires with relatively few men. When they introduced smallpox, it weakened resistance significantly. Also, this is a big reason the encomienda system was replaced by African slavery. Like, many of the indigenous slaves were dying of smallpox. Okay, the second major transfer that occurred during the Columbian Exchange included food and plants, and this transfer had major effects on both Old and New World. So, for example, European settlers brought wheat and olives and grapes, which were staple of European diet. Eventually, they also introduced African and Asian foods like rice and bananas and sugar. And then New World crops were also transferred to Europe, foods like maize and potatoes and manioc. And so the introduction of these nutrient-rich foods contributed to healthier populations in Europe, which led to a population explosion after 1700. Okay, third on the transfer list was animals, and by far the most significant were the animals introduced by Europeans into the Americas. Livestock like pigs and sheep and cattle were introduced, and because they had no natural predators in the Western Hemisphere, they multiplied rapidly. As a result, indigenous farmers were faced with the destruction of their environment as free-ranging animals trampled and grazed on their crops. But by far the most impactful animal to be introduced to the Americas by the Spanish was the horse. Indigenous groups in the Great Plains like the Apaches and the Comanches and the Kiowas used the horse to more effectively hunt large herds of buffalo, which was a staple food item for them. Additionally, horses also significantly changed warfare tactics, and bonus, that change had the effect of increasing violent conflict between various tribes and between European and indigenous groups. The introduction of the horse was a change that fundamentally altered their way of life. And then the fourth item to know in the Columbian Exchange was minerals, mainly gold and silver. Now, before the Spanish discovered that cash cropping would earn them a great deal of wealth in the Americas, their main focus was on extracting gold and silver from their colonial holdings. Now, I already talked about this when we talked about the gold motivation for exploration, so, I'll just leave it at that. And finally, the fifth major transfer was people. Now, some indigenous Americans were brought back to Europe, but by far the bigger impact was the millions of enslaved Africans transferred to colonial America in order to work the cash crop plantation. After having to endure the brutality of the dreaded Middle Passage across the Atlantic Ocean, they were met with equally brutal conditions as they were forced to work the field. Okay, here in the last section, let's tie it all up by considering a handful of effects that occurred as a result of this interaction between the Old and New World. And right out of the gate, you need to know that as contact between Europeans and the various indigenous peoples of the Americas increased, it became clear that their worldviews were very different. Or to say it plainly, these two groups saw the world completely different from each other, and you're going to need to know 4 examples. First, Europeans and indigenous people held drastically differing views on land use. Europeans believed that land could be owned by individuals, but the dominant indigenous belief was that land was a resource available to all and had a kind of spiritual quality to it, like a source of life, not a commodity available for private ownership. Second, they held different views on religion. As I mentioned before, Europeans were on the whole Christian and adhered to a complex set of dogmas and doctrines, most notably the doctrine doctrine of a single God. And although indigenous belief systems varied, many of them believed in multiple gods and spirits that inhabited and connected all living things, and therefore they did not separate the spiritual and material realms as was common in European Christianity. And then third, we've got differing views on gender roles. Europeans tended to be patriarchal, whereas indigenous people tended to be more egalitarian. Even to the extent that some family and power structures were matrilineal. And while indigenous men and women often held different roles in society, every individual played a vital role. And fourth, they held different views on family. Europeans' concept of family, especially in Western Europe, emphasized the nuclear family, whereas indigenous peoples lived together in extended families, which emphasized the importance of shared responsibility in child raising and respect for elders and cultural transmission. And so all that to say, most of the early years of contact between Europeans and indigenous groups were full of misunderstandings as they sought to make sense out of each other. But eventually, in some cases, Europeans and Native Americans adopted some useful aspects of each other's culture. For example, due to the Spanish effort to establish Christian missions in Southwest North America, many indigenous peoples converted to Christianity. Now, it's certainly arguable that these conversions occurred due to the heavy-handed and sometimes brutal tactics of the Spanish missionaries. You better give your heart to Jesus because your butt is mine. However, being polytheists, the indigenous people saw no conflict in adding the Christian God to the worship of their other gods. For example, the version of Guadalupe incorporates important aspects both of Christian and Aztec religious traditions. Or maybe it was enticing for the indigenous people to convert to Christianity when they observed that the Spanish remained largely unaffected by the epidemics killing large portions of the indigenous population. So maybe they were like, what's the harm of adding our boy Jesus to the mix of our other gods? Well, as it turned out, the Spanish missionaries could not abide Jesus being honored among other gods as an equal, and so some of them resorted to brutal tactics to bring indigenous people into Christian orthodoxy. Okay, now on the other side, European settlers adopted useful aspects of indigenous culture. For example, the English settlers in North America just about died before natives of the region taught them local agricultural techniques. And French settlers, mostly interested in the robust American fur trade, often intermarried with indigenous women in order to firm up trade relations, which I maintain is about the most fairy tale reason to get married that I've ever heard. But, big but, massive but, you have to know that even though the invading Europeans turned out to be a pretty powerful bunch, they got much of what they wanted in the Americas, indigenous people did resist their intrusion, and that basically happened in two ways. First, some indigenous groups engaged in diplomatic negotiations by allying with certain European groups in order to protect themselves. This occurred when several groups under Aztec power allied with the Spanish in order to topple the Aztecs. And second, there was military resistance. Now, the Pueblo Revolt won't happen to the next one. But it is a great example of indigenous people getting fed up with Spanish efforts to erase their culture and full-on defeating them in battle. But in this period, a good example is the Taino Rebellion. So in 1511, the native people of modern-day Puerto Rico rebelled against the Spanish because they had grown tired of the brutal conditions of the encomiendas encomienda system and the threat to their cultural traditions that the Spanish attempted to convert them to Christianity. Now, the Taino were much greater in number than the Spanish, and initially they had some success, but ultimately the superior Spanish weaponry won the day. And then the last effective contact I need to mention is this debate over the status of Native Americans and Africans. So after this prolonged contact between Europeans and Native Americans and Africans, a debate rose among Europeans about whether the brutal conditions of slavery, either through the encomienda system or African slavery, was justified. And in Spain, the status of indigenous people was argued in the Valladolid debate. On one side was Bartolomé de las Casas. Upon his arrival to the Americas, he actually owned indigenous slaves and even fought a war against them. However, over time, he became one of their chief advocates in Spain. He argued that indigenous people were human and thus ought not to be subject to the inhumane ravages of systems like encomienda. On the other side was Juan Gines de Sepulveda, who argued that indigenous people were in fact less than human and as such benefited from service to Europeans. So it's important to realize that this debate among the religious reveal that there was no singular agreement on exactly who these indigenous people were, since they were not mentioned in the Bible, and therefore there's no clear instruction on how they ought to be treated. And ultimately that question remained. But Europeans were able to develop novel justifications for their harsh treatment of Africans and indigenous people. For example, in order to justify the brutality of African slavery, Christians turned to the Bible, specifically an event known as the Curse of Ham. In the story, God curses Noah's son Ham to be a servant of his brothers, and it was said that God put a mark on him to signify his servitude. Now, the story doesn't say what the mark was, but Christians seeking to justify slavery decided that the mark must be dark skin, and that was enough for them to continue their brutal policies toward African and indigenous people. All right, click here to watch my other Unit 1 videos, and click here to get your hands on my 8-bush Heimler